Hey guys, it's Jim. Thanks for coming back. Hope you're doing well. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the raw develop filter in Luminar 2018. It's a powerful filter, and oddly, it's one that I haven't really addressed. I haven't used it in a lot of my videos, and shame on me, really, because it's an incredible filter, and I think one that's vitally important for you to understand so that you can get better at editing your photos. And to be clear, I create videos and tutorials, but I don't want to pretend that I know everything, because I don't. I'm learning stuff all the time. And one of the things I've been learning and reading about is highlights and shadows and whites and blacks and all those kind of things. So I want to talk about that because all of those things impact a photo. Highlights and whites are often grouped together and thought of as being the same, and they're not. Blacks and shadows are grouped together and thought of as being the same. They're not. And I want to do, have a conversation about this as well. And so, in addition, I'm going to talk about the histogram. And I'm going to do a basic edit of a photo, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so this is a photo I took here in Austin, and the first thing you're going to notice is it's kind of blown out, and it's blurry on the outside. It's only kind of crisp in the center of the photo. And that's because, hopefully you can see this, I shot it with this little lens here. This is called a lens baby, and I may actually do a review in this lens. It's a tiny little lens. It fits great on my Sony camera. I mean, it's so small, you can see, but it's got 3 different optics in it. And basically, if you're not familiar with the Lens Baby, I wrote about it on my blog. Anyway, this is not a commercial for them. It's not sponsored by them. My videos aren't sponsored by anybody, to be clear. But it's an incredible little lens, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. But the reason I'm talking about it is because I want to clarify what Lens Baby does with this lens is it creates with the settings I used, it creates a sharp center area of focus, and then the rest is all kind of blurry, and it gets blurrier as it goes out. So that's why the photo may look different to you. However, that's not the point of the video. The point of the video is the raw develop filter, and I want to be specific. I'm not talking about lens correction, and I'm not talking about transform. I'm only talking about the sliders on the adjust tab, and so I want to talk about those now. So coming down, the first thing I want to point out is that these are in a particular order, which is basically very similar, maybe the same as the order in which they fall in Lightroom. However, I don't edit my photos in that order. I work on things the way I want to work on them, and so we'll talk about that as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is the histogram. So if you look at the histogram, you can see that there's a distribution here. It represents the light in the photo. Things that are on the far left side of the histogram, that's the darker parts. And you can see there's a little bit here. There's a lot kind of in the middle-ish of the darker side, the left side, right? And then there's a little bit over here, and then there's some spikes where it's really bright, which is obviously going to be the sky. Now, if you notice when I hover my mouse over this, there's these 2 little triangles that come on. So if I click these triangles, that represents the hot and cold pixels. And you'll notice that the red just showed up when I click this right triangle. And if I hover over it like I do now, it says hot pixels. If I hover over this, it says cold pixels. The cold pixels are represented with blue instead of this red. You don't see them because there aren't any. So I'm just going to drop the blacks, and you can see all this blue comes into the photo, right? So this is just an overlay. All it's doing is giving you a visual cue that says, hey, these red parts are really hot pixels, which means they're potentially blown out, and the blue ones are really cold pixels. They're potentially too dark and unrecoverable. And so that's something to think about. I'm going to reset blacks, and there's also a hotkey. You can hit the J key, and if I hit J, both those triangles turn off. If I hit it again, they turn back on, right? So I'm going to hit it one more time, turn it off, and get it out of the way. And I use a Mac, and I apologize to the Windows users. I don't know if the hotkey, if the J key is the same key. I'm making the assumption that it is, but I don't know, so my apologies. Now, the thing I want to talk about is that highlights and shadows are generally thought of as going to, you work on highlights and shadows, you work on whites and blacks, but when you talk about highlights and whites, you often just kind of say, well, highlights are the brightest parts of the photo. And that's true, but whites also are the brightest parts of the photo, and the same with the blacks, shadows and blacks, those are the darkest parts of the photo. The difference is, and it's easier if I just show you, that they actually work differently. So I think a lot of, and I read a quote, I've been reading about this a lot, on somebody's blog, somebody basically said, they're thought of as twins. Highlights and whites are thought of as twins, but they're more like cousins. And I think that's a great analogy. Same with shadows and blacks. I think initially, before you really dive in and take a deeper look like I'm doing in this video, you think of them as being shadows and blacks as being twins, and they're not. They're more like cousins. So let me just show you what I mean. White, if I go to the right, the white parts get whiter, right? What this basically does is you're kind of setting your white point in your photo. And so you're basically saying, what do I consider true white? Because if you drag it all this way, you'll notice that you're losing a little bit. Let me reset it, right? You're losing some of the white in the sky, which is fine. That's a way to pull back some of that blown out. But let me show you the difference between what the whites do to the photo and what the highlights do. So that's what whites does at -100. And now look at highlights at -100. Completely different photo. And one of the key things is that you can recover detail in highlights and you're not going to recover detail in the whites. And I think this is a perfect example of it. So let me show you one more time. Whites all the way left, really not that different, right? Let me reset it. Highlights all the way left, vastly different. And so now, you're going to see some splotchy blur here because that's because of the lens. It's just a creative kind of fun effect. I like it. It's artistic and different. If you don't like it, that's okay. It's not an image quality issue. It's a feature of the lens, right? So anyway, that's immaterial to the content that we're talking about. So you can recover detail from highlights. And so for me, it becomes a dance, right? I don't want to take my white too far to the left because if I take both of them really far to the left, it gets a little bit too gray, and I don't want my whites to be gray. I want my whites like in that stag sign. And this is just a store down in South Austin where it's kind of a hipster, cool area. It's a lot of fun stuff. I like to shoot down there because there's neon and fun stuff. But anyway, for me, it's kind of a balance between the highlights and whites. There's a dance, and so you sort of have to play them off of one another. Now, here's another thing. Let me reset those. There's also a hotkey or a keystroke, whatever you call it, where you can hold down the Alt Option key. And again, this is a Mac, so on a Windows platform, I don't even know if there is an Alt Option key, but there's probably the same kind of keystroke you can do. But if you hold down that and then start pulling down the highlights, you'll notice that you get a mask that shows up. And this is basically showing where your highlights are. The white parts are incredibly blown out. You can see I'm dragging the highlights all the way to the right, and it's cranking up that stuff, and all the way to the left. And so what a lot of people do is they'll drag it to where you have a little bit of that white, and they'll say, okay, that's probably where I want my highlights to be. You can do the same on the white. So Alt and Option key, and then take that whites. And again, you can go all the way to the right, or you can go all the way to the left. But again, it's a little bit of a balance. I would probably go a little bit left and a little bit more left. And this is also where that J key comes in. Notice, let me reset these. Remember how much red there is. If you've activated the J key, and in other words, turn on that triangle in the upper right corner for hot pixels, you'll see that there's quite a few. And again, for me, the delicate dance is, how do I take the whites to the left to reduce the intensity of how bright things are and balance that with the highlights so that I don't get, my whites don't turn gray, because you like having white, and it really does impact the way the other colors look. And so I'm going to take it down, something like that. Let me hit the J key and hide it. I think that looks pretty good. Now you can do the same things with the highlights and shadows. And so you can grab this and you can turn on the J key if you want. And again, you're not seeing any blue because there's not anything that's really dark. But as I start bringing the shadows down, you can see it creeping in over here, right? That's shadows. Let me show you the difference. If I take blacks down, it takes on a whole new, you see it in a new light. And so again, that's the difference between shadows and blacks, just like the difference that I showed you earlier between highlights and whites. They really are different. And again, I keep using the word dance, but that's kind of what it is. There's kind of an ebb and flow to where you're wanting to find the best way to sort of manage the way your photo looks. So I'll often you hit the J key, turn on the hot and cold pixel indicators, and then, as you drag this left or right, you're going to see more or less of the red or the blue. And so that's usually how I start a photo. And then I might come down here. I like my black point. and maybe I want to bring the shadows down, creep a little bit of that in. You can also, just like highlights, where you can recover detail from highlights, you can also recover detail from shadows. And so, I might actually go this way and create a higher sort of dynamic range, where you have a broader distribution of light and less shadow. And so I might do something like that. I'm gonna hit the J key again and turn that off. That looks pretty good. Here's the thing. Using the highlights, whites, shadows, and blacks and all that, it impacts contrast. And so to me, it's vitally important that you make sure that you also are using contrast, because as I do that, and I'm gonna hit the J key again to turn this back on, as I increase contrast, you can see that the red is increasing and some of the blue is starting to creep into the darker areas. And so I'm getting some more of that visibility to the hot and cold pixels by simply increasing contrast. So that's a big deal. And for me, I'm trying to figure out what do I want this photo to look like. And that's why I use the word dance. I'm going to hit J again to turn that off. I'm always kind of going back and forth. I work on the highlights and shadows, the whites and the blacks. I do those things. And then I come back and I work on contrast. And I'm trying to find the delicate balance between them all. And maybe it's, not so much shadow increase. And maybe it's a little bit lower on the highlights, and maybe even a tiny bit less on the whites. And then, maybe I come back and say, all right, well, maybe I overdid contrast, or maybe I didn't have enough. Maybe I want more. And as I drag the contrast, I might say, well, I want to lift the shadows a little bit. And so there's not a science to this at all. It's purely art, and that's what it is. It's personal preference. I just wanted to illustrate some of the tools. At this point, let's say I've got this section, highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks, good. I've got contrast where I am. Sometimes I'll come in and say, maybe I want to reduce the exposure a little bit as well. And again, that might cause me to say, all right, now I'm going to bump the shadows a tiny bit more. And let me show you where we started, by the way. That's what we started at with a raw file. And all I've done is just a few of these sliders in raw develop, and it's really changed the picture. I haven't touched the colors, but look how different the colors look. That has to do with changing the white point, changing the black point, highlights, shadows, contrast, exposure. I've done nothing else except those things, and the colors look vastly different, much more blue in the sky, and I had a blown out sky that you would think I couldn't recover from, and I have. So this is the point where I come in and say, all right, I'm gonna add some clarity, because clarity is great at adding a little bit of depth, and for me, especially shooting with this little lens baby where you got that sharp center area and everything else kind of radiates out in more gradual blur. I want to have a little bit more crispness in the center, so that's where clarity comes in. And then that leaves white balance. And so this is what I always do, is I move the temperature and tint sliders. And in this case I might say a little too blue. I want to warm it up a tiny bit, and maybe I want to increase the tint. And I like that look, but now that I've warmed it up, it took some of the blue out of the sky, and now I might say, gosh, I kind of want to take my highlights down, and so I might drop that a little bit more to recover a little bit more of that in the sky. Just, again, it's a dance, but that's the order I do them in. I do highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, then I work on exposure and contrast, which means I end up going back to highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Then I'll add some clarity, and then I go to a white balance. Here's the other thing. You can come in here, and it'll default to as shot, right? If you're shooting as a raw file, which I highly recommend. And by the way, you have all these tools in the develop filter, which is the same as raw develop, but you're better off shooting raw. More data, more things you can recover. When you're pushing these highlights around, you're going to recover a lot more detail from highlights and shadows with a raw file than you ever will with a JPEG. So you have these, I'll call them presets, for lack of a better word. You can come in and click daylight, and it impacts the way the photo looks, right? Basically, these presets are moving the temperature and tint sliders. So as I change this to shade, you'll notice those have shifted. If I change this to tungsten, it gets very blue. Fluorescent, right? Kind of really too blue. Flash, actually that looks pretty good. And then there's one other thing to know, and that's the eyedropper tool. So you have this eyedropper, and if you click on it, it activates and it says pick a target neutral. So you can come around here and you can say, what do I consider a neutral color in this photo? Well, maybe I consider that right there neutral. And as soon as you click on it, the temperature and tint sliders are going to adjust because they're saying, all right, what you just clicked on is neutral. And so I need to adjust my color balance, my temperature and tint based on, or my white balance, not color balance, my white balance based on the fact that that's neutral. So that wasn't a good neutral because it made it too purple. You can do that, and then you can come in here and adjust these sliders and say, well, I like it kind of, but I'm going to pull back the purple and maybe give it a little more blue and just customize it. You can also just get the eyedropper again and say, well, that's a better target neutral. Okay, made it really blue. Maybe this concrete is a good target neutral. Apparently not. So that's all I'm saying. I rarely use the eyedropper. I prefer to move the sliders because I've yet to come across a photo where I choose one of the presets or use the eyedropper and get exactly what I want. But that's just me. That's personal taste. So I would come in here, maybe warm this up a little bit, give it a little bit of tint, maybe something like that. And let me show you before and after. Came a long way. To be clear, if you've watched any of my videos, I love the filters in Luminar, and you know I'm going to go get color balance, and I'm going to get tone, and I'm going to get to these other filters and play around. This wasn't a workflow video. I'm not going to fully edit the photo. This was specifically about the Adjust tab in Raw Develop. I think we covered a lot. I mean, we talked about the histogram. We talked about all the white balance and temperature and tint, exposure, contrast, all the highlights and shadows, whites and blacks, and adding clarity, and the, you know, again, the delicate dance between how do you get your exposure looking just right using all those sliders. And, you know, hopefully I shared some tips for you that are helpful. That's the before, which I would have looked at and said, that's a blown out mess. I'm never going to recover. This guy is never going to look good. And I would have tossed it. And I turned it into that. I've come a long way. It's kind of a long video, but there's a lot to talk about. And I just wanted to look, I think that's it. I'm trying to look at my notes. That's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll be back soon with more videos. You know what? If you're interested, I've got some info about the Lens Baby lens on my blog, and I may do a video review on it as well. It's a lot of fun. It's a free and freeing way to go shoot. And for me, it's all about the art of the thing. And I love this artistic look. But also, when I'm editing, that's what I'm talking about. So I talked about some things that are kind of scientific about, you know, balancing the whites and all that. But the truth is, make your photos look how you want them to look because they're your photos, and you should. So have fun with it. Enjoy what you're doing. And that's it for today. So I'm signing off. Thanks for coming. If you haven't liked or subscribed or any of that, please do share this with your friends. Leave a comment. Let me know if you like this kind of video where I kind of dive into some theory. It's kind of fun for me, but I want it to be useful for you. So thanks, and let me know. And I'll talk to you soon, my friends. Take care, and adios.